We can think about reading development as happening in cycles, cycles that self-extend and snowball into what seems like miraculous natural acquisition of reading abilities. And also sometimes there are kinks in that cycle that make it go backwards in a negative cycle of reading failure and disappointment, which can look like unexplained difficulty learning to read. So to think about these cycles of reading success or reading failure that kids might sort of get stuck in either over time or even within one sitting. You could have this sort of experience of a cycle of success or a cycle of failure even in one class period. I'm going to talk through in general how this cycle happens and then tell a few stories to illustrate it. So this cycle can start at any point in the cycle, but say we start with the idea of engagement in reading. So maybe somebody read to you and you enjoyed that experience and you thought reading text, sitting down with a book or paying attention to environmental text, posters on the wall or menus at a restaurant, that engaging with text is a pretty good idea and you felt confident that if you wanted to do it, you could. That might mean that you spend time doing it. And when you spend time paying attention to text, you get practice recognizing words. And word recognition is a skill that requires practice. It requires some coaching to understand how letters and sounds work together in combinations. It requires sometimes some help making sure that you're recognizing words accurately. And if you spend time reading, you get lots of practice decoding. And if you have practice decoding, you might be exposed to new words that people don't say out loud a lot. There's lots of words that we really only see in print. People don't often start conversations with once upon a time, but you will see that in lots of stories. So if you're reading, you're exposed to a whole other set of vocabulary that you wouldn't necessarily hear just in your peer group or among the people you interact with often. And if you can recognize the words and you know what they mean, then you can read them fast and smooth enough to understand. And that would be comprehension. Now, fluency, we're not looking for like rapid reading. We're just looking for fast and smooth enough to understand so that you don't forget the beginning of the sentence by the time you got to the end of the sentence. Just fast and smooth enough to keep the words in mind so you can think about them and make meaning from them. So if you comprehend what you read, if you understand the words that you recognize, the meanings of the words, you read it fast and smooth enough to understand, then you have a shot at engagement. Engagement means that you like and feel good about what you're doing. If you didn't understand, there's really no way you could like or feel good about it because it's not fun to just sort of say words off a page. But if those words carry some meaning, they do something for you, they create enjoyment or give you information you want, then that could be an engaging experience which would build your confidence that if you picked up a book again, it would probably be good too. And that leads you to spend time reading, which gives you more practice and more exposure, which allows you to read quickly and smoothly enough to understand. If you understand, you might like it. And if you like it, you'll feel good about it. If you feel good about it, you'll spend time doing it, which means more practice and more exposure. And that means that practice and exposure means you can read fast and smooth enough to understand. And if you understand, if and only if you understand, you might like it. And if you like it, you'll feel good about it. And so you spend time doing it, so you get more practice and more exposure. So you read fast and smooth enough to understand. If you understand, you might like it, and you might feel good about it. If you feel good about it, you spend time doing it, so you get more practice and more exposure. And read fast and smooth enough to understand. And if you understand, you like it. Do you see what I'm saying? So this cycle becomes a snowball cycle, and you're on this cycle of reading success, practicing lots and lots of word recognition, being exposed to all kinds of new vocabulary, which makes you a stronger and stronger reader so that the more you read, the better you are at reading. That's the cycle of reading success that we hope kids are always on all the time. However, in small ways and in very large ways, sometimes this cycle gets interrupted. There might be a kink at any one of these points in the cycle that starts things going a little bit backwards. And it looks like this. So say you sat down to read something you didn't understand, and you thought, well, that wasn't very interesting or exciting or fun, and so I don't really have confidence in myself as a reader of this text. I don't think that if I spend time reading it, I'm going to get very much out of it. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading this particular text, which means that I'm going to have less practice with the words that appear in this text. I'm going to have less exposure to the meanings of words in the text, and I won't be able to make very good guesses about what those words mean if I see them other places. Which means that when I do read a text like this, I'm not going to read it quickly and smoothly enough to understand, and since I don't understand, I don't really like this text. So this could happen the first time somebody shows up to an AP chemistry class. Maybe they in general are a very successful reader, but they show up and they pick up their brand new textbook and they crack it open and they see a lot of vocabulary words they don't understand, and it really slows them down. And when they're slowed down, they find that they don't know the meanings, and then they lose their place and they don't really understand what they're reading, so they don't like reading that chemistry textbook and they don't feel good about their ability to do it, which means unless they absolutely have to, they're not going to be flipping through it just reading along for fun. They're going to do it as quickly as they can, and that means that they have less practice reading those sorts of words, less exposure to the words you see in there, less ability to read them quickly and smoothly enough to understand, and then that just sort of continues on the cycle. And that could get interrupted by someone who supports them in understanding those words, or who talks about the concept before they go off to read the book, or explains a few of those words while they're reading the book. And we can fix that kink really quickly, but this kink can also happen over time. Because we all have sort of individual differences in our fluency and in our vocabulary. So a student who comes to school less confident about their reading is likely to spend less time reading, which means they have less practice, less exposure, and they read less quickly and smoothly, and so they're exposed to less. So here's a story about me and my sister. And say for a moment that we had the exact same first grade teacher, the exact same texts in the classroom and opportunities to read, but she read at about 100 words per minute, and I read, let's say, at about 60 words per minute. That means that given 10 minutes of practice, she's going to read 40% more words than I am, which means 40% more practice and 40% more exposure. So she's going to read that much faster and smoother than I am. And her trajectory is going to be exponential. Her trajectory is going to go faster and farther than mine is. So given 10 minutes, she might breeze through a couple of those little readers that first graders read. And I might maybe make it through one. So say she has 2 or 3 times the exposure and the practice. She also has 2 or 3 times the exposure to story structures and ideas and background knowledge that you get from text. She feels much better about herself as a reader. She feels pretty confident, and she probably is going to spend more time. And so we call this in reading the Matthew effect. And that's after the story of Matthew in the Bible, where the rich get richer. If you're really good at reading, you read more and you get more out of your reading and you become an even better reader. And also the poor get poorer. If you aren't very good at reading, you don't like it and don't feel good about it, you're not likely to invest in the kind of practice and the kind of exposure, but also your practice is going to be to cover less ground until you build up and develop it. So the good news is, once we get started on a cycle of success, we can experience exponential growth from whatever our starting point is. But we all might have different starting points, and that can be really discouraging for kids, and it can make it look like some people are just naturally amazing readers, and that's magical, or that's unfair. And it can make students look around and think, well, there must be something wrong with me, that I'm not as good as somebody else. So when we think about designing instruction for students, we have to realize that there are always going to be individual differences in the kind of practice and the kind of exposure kids have had, but also their experiences of confidence and engagement with text. And you might be the teacher that really supports their engagement, really gives them a reason to engage with a text for the first time. Or you might be a teacher who really builds their confidence by reading along with them, or making sure they have text that they can and want to read, text at a level that they can understand successfully, so that they get caught in that cycle of success that self-extends. You might be a teacher that's really good at explaining concepts before students read them in text, so that they don't have kinks in the vocabulary area that compromise their fluency and compromise their understanding, and therefore the likelihood that they're going to like the text they see in your class. So even though we can get kinked and slowed down at any part of this cycle, we can also support kids at every part of this cycle, both in the short term and in a single class period, and also over the long term, thinking about how much practice and how much time they're spending with texts that they can read, that they want to read, that gives them that optimal practice to get caught in a cycle of success.